Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, formerly Baseball Info Solutions. I'll get that figured out one day. He's Aaron Schatz from Football Outsiders, and the show is brought to you by Fantasy Insiders. Aaron, how's it going? We've had a couple of interesting weeks of games, I'd say, and some pretty unprecedented trends, I'd say, in some of the NFL stats that we're going to touch on today. How's it going?
Well, I mean, week two was weird. For people who have seen it, Football Outsiders, week two was, based on what you would expect from Vegas lines. Week two was one of the 10 most surprising weeks of upsets since 1979. And, I don't think it's any different if you look at the Football Outsiders ratings. The bottom 5 teams in our Dave ratings, those are the sort of power ratings that combine our in-season numbers with our preseason numbers. The bottom 5 teams all won in week 2. And our premium picks went 6-10 straight up, but 11-5 against the spread, which is basically unheard of. You'll have a couple of weeks every year, right, where you pick better against the spread than you do straight up. I mean, the spread is designed that you should always be better straight up than you are against the spread, because the spread is designed to make everybody 8-8.
Sure, that makes total sense.
And you'll have a couple of weeks every year where, if you pick both ways, the way we do, where you will be better against the spread than straight up. But usually it's by a game or 2, never by 5. It's nuts. Last week with the upsets was nuts. And I think it's led to a lot of jumping to conclusions. We always talk about week 1 as jump to conclusions week. There's been a lot of jumping to conclusions in week 2 also, based on what I think will end up being in the long run a lot of upsets that don't, correlate with how these teams play necessarily for the last 14 games.
Well, I do love the upheaval. It makes for some very interesting television. And I think the upheaval may be centered on the Arizona Cardinals start to this season. A lot of the content you just mentioned is available at Football Outsiders, and I was looking at your most recent article on your DVOA updates, and Arizona is just dominating in DVOA this season. They are the number 1 team. They're nearly twice the rating of the number 2 team, which is the Jets. They're actually the 7th best 2-0 team since you guys have DVOA ratings back to 1989. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what that means, the 2007 New England Patriots were 5th. So they've basically been the New England Patriots from 2007 so far this season. What gives, Aaron? Is this team really that good? How are they being so successful?
Right. The problem is that it's only 2 games, and that because it's this early in the season, we don't know, we don't make opponent adjustments. So what we have is we have our knowledge of what we think about the teams they've played, but that's not incorporated into the rating. And there's definitely an argument that it should be, and that argument is less an argument about how stats should be and more an argument about how much free time I have, because it's always been a goal to redo our early season ratings so that they incorporate opponent adjustments that are based on our preseason projections, but I've never had the time to do it. If we did that for this year, then what you would discover, of course, is that the 2 games that Arizona has won are 2 games that that they had a good chance of winning even when we thought they were just an average team before the season. These were not the hardest games on their schedule by any means. But it turns out that New Orleans and Chicago look worse than we expected. I mean, they both played really badly in their other game, right? Not against Arizona.
Sure.
Chicago lost to Green Bay by a healthy amount, and New Orleans lost to Tampa at home, for crying out loud. And the other thing is, Arizona didn't just beat them close. They beat them huge. That New Orleans game, DVOA gives Arizona like 60% or something. Not what you would expect from a game that was just 1 touchdown until the last couple of minutes. And the second game, I mean, they just destroyed them, right? Arizona has a single game DVOA of 107%. And there's only going to be 5 or 6 games in a season where a team is over 100%, and this was one of them. So Arizona has just been colossal.
I think an average football fan would probably think that if a team wins a close game, then that win is hugely important because obviously in terms of their chances to make the playoffs, a win is hugely important. But one thing DVOA tends to suggest is that playing in a close game tells you a lot more about the team than whether they actually won that game or lost that game. And I think what we're touching on here is sort of the flip side of that coin, which is maybe an average fan doesn't think it's that impressive for Arizona to run up the score on a team like the Saints and the Bears, both of whom are the worst two teams rated by DVOA so far this season. But I think that the way DVOA works and what the research suggests is that when you run up the score on these bad teams, that does tell you something about the quality of the team. Isn't that true?
Yes. Great teams are generally identified by their huge wins over bad opponents, not by their close wins over good opponents. That's absolutely true. That being said, a huge win over a good opponent tells you even more than a huge win over a bad opponent. So I think once opponent adjustments kick into these games, this is going to look more like this is going to look more like what it would look like to have a comfortable but not dominating win over a good opponent. Because to dominate a team that's a really bad team, it is about as good as beating Pittsburgh by 14. It's about as good to beat Chicago by 28 as it is Pittsburgh by 14, if that makes any sense. And the thing is that, what we knew about Arizona going into this season still is true, right? This is still a team that won a ton of close games last year that was not as good as its record. This is still a team whose quarterback is old and injury-prone. This is still a team which lost a lot of defensive talent in the offseason. And that's before you include the defensive talent that didn't come back, right? Like Darnell Dockett missed all last year and was gone. Darrell Washington suspended all last year, didn't come back. Plus, they lost guys like Larry Foote and Antonio Cromartie and a number of other guys. So, and they lost their defensive coordinator, who was, in many ways was seen by a lot of people as the secret behind a lot of their blitzing success. Otherwise, Todd Bowles would not have gotten a head job for the Jets. So I asked on Twitter for people to send a question to be answered by the end of the show, and I can answer one of them right now. Ben Eisenstadt asked, which team has the biggest gap between your subjective view of how good they are and what the numbers say about them? And the answer is Arizona. Because I can't see Arizona truly as the best team in the NFC, and the numbers say that through 2 weeks at least, they've been the best team in the NFL, and it's not even close. But they are definitely better than what we thought they were before the season, right? Before the season, we had Arizona as like a slightly below average team that was going to look worse because of a hard schedule. My guess is that what they really are is a slightly above average team that has had 2 big wins early and is also going to end up looking worse in the long run because of a hard schedule. The schedule gets much harder from here on out for Arizona.
And for everyone hanging their hat on the fact that, hey, Carson Palmer's been back. When he's been healthy in recent season, the Cardinals have been much better. That's a topic we hit on a couple of weeks ago where we basically noted that actually because of the timing of the injuries, Palmer's been able to dodge a lot of these harder opponents. So really, I think the games that he's going to play against the Rams and the Seahawks of the world will probably tell us a lot more about how good this team really is.
Right, and he's still dodging, right? New Orleans and Chicago may end up as the 2 worst defenses in the league by the end of the year. And that's not something I'm saying based just on the first 2 games. Like, that's how we had it projected. Mm-hmm. When we projected the season, we projected New Orleans, Atlanta, and Chicago as the 3 worst defenses for this season. So I'm not jumping to conclusions just based on the first 2 weeks. Like, these are bad defenses.
For sure. One of the teams that we think Arizona may face that could prove a challenge has actually been off to a little bit of a rough start. You might have heard the Seattle Seahawks. They're 0-2. They're actually one of several teams that projected before the season were top 10 in DVOA, but have actually lost both of the first 2 games. Those other teams include the Colts, the Ravens, and the Eagles. So with those starts, Aaron, I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this. Let's start with which of these teams, despite the fact that they've played badly so far, have a chance to turn it around and start playing well through the rest of the season.
They all do. I mean, listen, let us all remember last year. It's, we should certainly learn the lessons of 1 year ago. That should not be out of our memories. And we all remember what New England looked like when they were 2-2. And we always remember when Seattle was 3-3, although Seattle certainly didn't look bad when they were 3-3. I mean, they looked good. They had just lost close games. And remember Aaron Rodgers telling everybody to relax when Green Bay was 1-2.
Yeah.
So don't overreact to early losses. So, I mean, there's two questions here with these 0-2 teams. The first is, what does 0-2 do to your chances of making the playoffs? And the second is, what have we learned about how good a team you are overall? Because there's no question about it. Going 0-2 is really bad for your chances of making the playoffs. It's not good to start with 2 losses. You only get 16 shots at this.
Yeah. So one thing that I'll point out about both the Ravens and Eagles is neither team has really allowed very much pressure to get to their quarterbacks. And we really haven't seen a ton of great offensive production from either team so far. But to me, that's something that sort of makes me optimistic about both teams going forward, especially, I guess, from the Ravens' perspective as a team that has traditionally had a very good defense, still has a lot of good defensive personnel. Are you sort of seeing with maybe the Ravens specifically a team that looks still pretty good, even though they actually haven't won their games?
Oh, absolutely. Baltimore is 17th in DVOA despite being 0-2. Baltimore and the Giants are the best teams in our ratings at 0-2, roughly average. So they haven't really been necessarily a bad team so far. They've lost a couple of close games. Both those teams have. Obviously, the Giants have lost those close games in very bad ways.
Agonizingly, I'd say, yes.
The problem for the Ravens, I agree with you, the pass protection is a good sign for the future. With the Eagles, I think the pass protection has more to do with the structure of their offense.
That's what I was going to think, too, yeah. They're so quick, yes.
Yeah, well, not only are they so quick, but they were throwing deep the last couple of years. Well, Bradford can't throw deep, so they're not going deep anymore, which means they're not having plays where he sits back there, takes a 7-step drop, and waits for a guy to get downfield. So, as fast as they are, they're even faster, because everything for him tends to be, right out of his hands immediately with lots of screens and whatnot. Baltimore is much more of a conventional offense, so I think that the lack of pass pressure is a better sign for them. The problem is that of those 0-2 teams, Baltimore is the one that faces the most competition in its division, right? Cincinnati is 2-0. Pittsburgh is 1-1, but they dominated San Francisco so much that we have them third in our ratings through 2 weeks.
And there's probably not a lot of shame in losing to New England. Obviously, that's one of the other better teams in the league.
Right. So Pittsburgh is a really good team. Cincinnati is a good team. So the problem for Baltimore is that while they're, even at 0-2, it certainly doesn't look like they're much different from what we expected before the season. They're kind of stuck behind Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. Cincinnati's 2-0 and Pittsburgh's 1-1, but they got the hardest game on their entire schedule off the books the first week. So we have Baltimore only with a 16% chance in our playoff odds now to make the playoffs. The team that's still got the highest chances is really Seattle, because we still think Seattle is really good. I mean, when you incorporate what we thought of them before the season, they were the clear front runner before the season, right? They were the Super Bowl favorite. And there's no doubt that there have been problems, especially on defense. But you don't want to jump to conclusions after 2 games. I think the worry for Seattle is, and this hopefully changes a little bit with Cam Chancellor back, but the depth that they've had in the past has gradually been depleted by players leaving for other places. And so they don't have the depth anymore to play that hardcore defense the whole game. And if they start having injuries, there's a real worry. But I do think that from everything we know about these players in the past, the starters are going to play better in the future than they've played the first 2 weeks.
There's probably nothing more damaging to your public perception than looking terrible in a Monday night game. That's what happened to the Colts. But it still kind of looks like that division is pretty weak. I mean, Houston has been a bit of a mess. The Titans, after winning big in Week 1, lost to the Browns. Do the Colts still have a decent chance of making the playoffs, or have what we've seen about their ability to actually move the ball affected what we think about their ability, regardless of how weak the division is?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell always through 2 weeks. I will admit, at some point soon, we're going to have to reevaluate how we judge teams early in the season and how much weight we put on preseason projection versus early performance. And I do have a feeling that we may be putting a little bit too much weight on early performance through the first 2 weeks with a team like the Colts, which is 29th in DVOA through
Nice.
2 weeks, but played a team that we know is, 2 teams that we know are better than we thought they were before the season, or better than most people seem to think, with Buffalo and the Jets. That being said, the Colts were not a great team to begin with. We only had them projected something like 12th before the season. We had them projected with high Super Bowl odds simply because their division was so poor. Well, Tennessee looks like a better team than we thought before the season. That may just be the one game against Tampa, but they look a little bit better. Jacksonville won a game. Again, we don't know how good they really are. But as a result, the Colts, the dominating that division doesn't look quite as likely as it did before. What really looks likely is that the whole division is just mediocre. I looked at our playoff odds simulations. In 28% of our current simulations, the entire AFC South goes 8-8 or worse.
Wow, that sounds a lot like the NFC South in recent seasons.
Yeah, the AFC South is the new NFC South, and the NFC South is basically the same. Except that they get to play the AFC South, so they'll be a little bit better this year. The NFC South was not as bad as people thought last year. They had tough schedules, and those teams were not all terrible. They were just all mediocre. AFC South, we don't quite know what to believe about these teams, but they don't look like they're as close to average as what like Atlanta, New Orleans, and Carolina were a year ago.
I appreciate you coming to my team's defense, as much of a defense as that could be. We actually have more on the NFC South coming up. But first, let's talk a little bit about the NFC East, which continues to be a fascinating division with all the things that are happening there. We talked about how bad the Eagles have looked so far. We talked about how the Giants have lost both of their games in frustrating fashion. It sort of made it look like Dallas was going to be completely in the driver's seat in this division, and they have won their first two games. But then Tony Romo got injured. I believe it's a broken collarbone, and he could be out between 6 and 9 weeks. And I was really fascinated by what that did to the team's ratings. I believe by Dave, they're now the 21st team overall, which Dave is incorporating the fact that they're not going to have Romo for that 6 to 9 week stretch. So I guess my first question for you, Aaron, is how big a deal is it that they're downgrading from Romo to Whedon over a half a season or so? Is that taking away 1 win, 2 wins, 3 wins? What exactly do we think the impact is for a team that, at least last year, was able to run the ball pretty effectively and maybe could minimize the loss of the quarterback by adjusting the game plan to run the ball more heavily?
I'd say that it's taking away a little bit more than 1 win on average. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot when you have only a 16-game season and 2 of them have been played already. And yeah, if we do Dave in such a way that it's based on how Dallas has played so far, which is not very good, but it's based on a projection that has Romo as the quarterback for the whole year, even if that projection also says Des Bryant is going to be out, then Dallas is roughly 12th or 13th.
Right.
If you have Whedon as the quarterback for the entire year, then Dallas is like 25th. And the playoff odds report now is based on the idea of Whedon as quarterback through week 9. Romo returns sometime between week 10 and week 13. And it gives Dallas 8.6 wins on average. If you run the whole thing with Whedon at quarterback, then they have 8.1 wins on average. So, you kind of extrapolate there. Having Whedon in the last half of the season would mean about a half a win. So having Whedon in the first half of the season means about a half a win. It's a little bit more than a win between the entire 14-week period.
Sure. It sounds like we're talking about a few different things here, actually. This reminds me of our preseason conversation where you mentioned that teams like New England and maybe 1 or 2 others were well clear of the pack. And then it seems like there's just this huge middle class of teams where while Dallas may be only losing a win, say, from downgrading at quarterback for this half of the season or whatever, there's so many teams in the mix at sort of that middle ground that could lead to just a huge drop-off in terms of expected playoff success. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you was the fact that the Cowboys have actually won their 2 games and, in fact, beaten the Eagles and Giants in those 2 games, 2 teams that presumably would be their biggest competition in the division, although the Redskins are 1-0 or 1-1, so maybe that's not true. But those fact that those wins are banked and they have those divisional wins, does that help them significantly in terms of likelihood to win the division going forward?
Oh, sure, absolutely, because if you look at the mean wins as 8.6, that means that they're only expected to win 6.6 the rest of the way, right?
Right.
So the Giants are expected to win 7.1 the rest of the way, the Eagles 6.9, Frankly, that Eagles projection, like I said about the Colts, it may be overreacting to the first 2 weeks a little bit. And Washington 5.7. Okay, Washington is a little overrated here. It was one win over St. Louis, right? They played badly in week 1. Everything we know about them from the past is that they're not a very good team. Both of their games have been at home, so they still have 8 road games left. And remember, Washington's 2 games against Dallas don't take place till December and January, which means they have to play Tony Romo twice, assuming Romo recovers from the collarbone as expected. And that makes it even harder for them. I think the idea of Washington as the hot team in the NFC East is pretty misguided. But Dallas with 6.6 mean wins expected, right, for the rest of the season means if they had started 0-2, and let's say they started 0-2 and the Giants started 2-0, okay. Well, now we would be expecting Dallas to end the season around 6.6 and the Giants at 9.1. That's a huge difference.
It's huge.
Okay? And if you have Whedon the whole year, by the way, all 4 teams in the NFC East are become below average teams, just like the AFC South looks right now. It's only getting Romo back in the second half of the year that makes Dallas an above average team again. So the quarterback injury is colossal. You have to remember also, the idea of replacement level is based on an average. What's it like if you have an average backup quarterback and you have an average starter? But Dallas doesn't have that. Dallas has an above average starter, and based on the evidence that we have from the past, a below average backup. Although it's willing to argue that part of Whedon being so below average in Cleveland was the players around him in Cleveland. And so in Dallas, with those better players around him, he's more of an average backup. But still, that means the gap between the two is larger than it would be for an average team. And this is a case with a number of the quarterback injuries right now. The gap between Drew Brees and Luke McCown is larger than the average gap between a starter and his backup. The gap between Cutler and Clausen is larger than the average gap between a starter and his backup. I mean, the largest in the league would probably be Ben Roethlisberger and Gronkowski, maybe, depending on how good we think Garoppolo is for New England. But The Dallas gap is pretty big.
Does the fact that they went out and acquired Matt Castle move the needle at all if, say, he's ready to play in their offense within a week or two? Or is he similar in type of player by DVOA to
Brandon Whedon?
Yeah, to Whedon, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's, based on what we know about the past, it looks like Castle's a little bit better, but it's hard to tell because some of that could just be that Castle had better teammates around him than Whedon did. But, I mean, I would definitely say our projection for Dallas would be a little bit higher with Castle at quarterback, but not much. And I doubt he becomes quarterback before their bye. They have the bye week, I believe, in week 6. And so you figure it takes him a couple of weeks to learn the offense. The logical time to pull Whedon and put in Castle would be after the Cowboys get crushed by the Patriots in week 5. in the game that looked like it was going to be Garoppolo and Romo and is now Brady versus Whedon. I mean, I realize Brady versus Castle is a great story, but honestly, it's a story we've done already. This wouldn't be the first time that we had Castle returning to play the Patriots. It happened just last year, and if you remember correctly, the Vikings got crushed.
Yeah, I'm sure Castle wouldn't mind skipping that game and then starting back another week or so later. With the NFC East troubles, it's kind of looking harder and harder to come up with the wild card teams in the NFC, which is, I think, a nice transition to talk about the NFC South, as we teased earlier, because 2 teams in the South, the Falcons and the Panthers, are 2-0. It feels to me particularly like Atlanta is getting a lot of buzz. Part of that is because of the good preseason expectations. In fact, Football Outsiders had them as one of the playoff teams because... Yeah,
I was going to say, who else had really big preseason expectations for the Atlanta Falcons besides us? We were out there, man. We were driving the Atlanta bandwagon. I am the driver of the Atlanta Falcons bandwagon.
That's true. I'll give you that credit. The fact of the matter is I tend to read people like you, and that's sort of the small anthill that I play in. But everybody is now joining in onto your bandwagon with Atlanta now that they've won their 2 games. But I have several questions about them as a team. The first is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but they've won both of their games late in the fourth quarter after trailing. And it's sort of my perception of things would tend to be, the fact that they were in these close games might tell you more about the quality of their team than the fact that they actually won them. That being the case, how do you sort of balance that with the fact that, okay, your preseason expectations liked this team and the fact that they do have these 2 banked wins now and have such an easy schedule through the rest of the season?
Oh, it's such an easy schedule. It is such an easy schedule. I tweeted something out yesterday. I ran a projected rest of schedule list based on the Dave ratings, okay? Yeah. So not based on how teams have played so far, but based on a combination of how they've played so far and the preseason projection to kind of get a better idea of where these teams are. Accounting for the Tony Romo injury, which is really big, by the way, because Atlanta and New Orleans play Dallas without Romo. Carolina may play Dallas with Romo. We're not sure because it's in that sort of middle ground where we don't know exactly which week he'll come back.
Right, yeah.
The average remaining opponent for Atlanta is minus 9.7%. Okay, New Orleans has the next easiest remaining schedule. Their average opponent is minus 5%. So essentially, Atlanta has a schedule remaining that is twice as easy as any other remaining schedule in the entire NFL. Take the easy schedule we thought they had before the season, and then add to that the Saints don't look as good as expected, that the Colts don't look as good as expected, that they play Dallas without Romo and Bryant and all the defensive players are still suspended, right? They still have Greg Hardy suspended, and they still have Rolando McClain suspended when they play Dallas this week. My God, does Atlanta's schedule look easy. I mean, this team is just going to waltz into the playoffs. It's ridiculous.
I'm not sure I disagree about that, but I do want to talk a little bit about how good we think Atlanta actually is. Because even if they waltz into the playoffs, this could be a case where they're not a very good team at all, and maybe they'll just get beaten badly in the first round. The thing that I've noticed a lot in watching their games so far this season is I feel like people believe in the narrative that they've really turned their defense around. Obviously, they bring in Dan Quinn, who used to be the coordinator in Seattle, a guy who's very strong defenses, obviously. They draft Vic Beasley, who's a big brand-name pass rusher. But one thing I've noticed through 2 games is, despite the narrative, they really haven't turned it around in terms of a pass rush. I looked at sacks plus pressures in the 2 games so far. They're tied for the 3rd fewest with just 4, ahead of only Oakland and Chicago, tied with Dallas, behind Indianapolis. They're really not generating the pressure that the narrative is suggesting that they are. So I'm questioning whether that defense really has improved at all. Not that they can improve going forward, but I'm not sure it's happened so far. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they've played better. I mean, they're 13th in DVOA, but again, no opponent adjustments yet, and only 2 games. And once you saw what happened with Philadelphia in week 2, the fact that Atlanta, kind of held them down in week 1 looks less impressive. I've got to say that if you look at the 2 teams, Atlanta and Carolina has a higher DVOA than Atlanta through 2 games. And I'm a bigger believer. I'm guessing that the Carolina defense finishes closer to its current rating of 3rd than the Atlanta defense finishes close to its current rating of 13th. I think the Carolina defense is probably not that good, but it's closer to that than the Atlanta defense is closer to what its ranking is. I mean, those are your boys, the Panthers.
Yeah.
And I think that so far it looks like that improvement from the second half of the season in defense has carried over. Obviously, they haven't faced great quarterbacks yet.
For sure.
But, if Bortles really has taken a step forward, like he looked in week 2, their week 1 performance looks better. Overall, the problem for Carolina is the same problem they had before the season, which is that by finishing 1st last year in the division, the schedule gives them Green Bay and Seattle as their 2 games that are determined by what place you are in the standings. And if Seattle is better than they've looked so far, and I think most of us believe that's the case, that's pretty tough on Carolina compared to who Atlanta has to play.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and that could be end up being the deciding factor. But the thing that I'll note about the Panthers' defense is that while they don't have a brand name, I would say, in their defensive line the way that Vic Beasley is for the Falcons, they are generating a ton of pressure. They've actually had 16 sacks plus pressures, fewer than only Pittsburgh so far. And it's guys like, it's not even Charles Johnson necessarily, it's guys like Wes Horton and Mario Addison and Coney Ealy and Kawan Short, guys that even people listening to this show probably have no idea who these guys are. But they have a bunch of solid players in a rotation there generating this pass pressure. And then obviously they do have, more star power in the linebacker core. I think there's a lot of solid players on that defense and I agree with you that it could be the real strength of the team, maybe one of the best 5 units in the game, which is why I tend to think the Panthers probably are a little bit better than the Falcons, even if they have a harder road going forward.
What I can tell you is these teams are both going to the playoffs. I mean, it's right now, the playoff odds report, I believe that both of these teams are currently over 70% to make the playoffs, and exactly it's 80% for Atlanta and 63% for Carolina, right? Because of the fact that their schedule gets harder. But wild card wise, these are the top 2 teams for wild card chances right now in the NFC. Carolina makes the wild card in 26% of simulations. Atlanta gets a wild card at 24%. So there are a ton of simulations where both Atlanta and Carolina make the playoffs. And I think that there's a very high probability that that's going to happen. And I agree with you. I mean, I think Carolina is probably the slightly better team overall. The problem is Atlanta's offense is a lot better than I think Carolina's offense
for
is.
sure. And that's kind of where I was going next, is that, on the flip side of the stat that I just mentioned about sacks plus pressures, Carolina has allowed 13 sacks plus pressures to Cam Newton so far this season, and Atlanta only 8, which is the 11th fewest in the league. That looks like a place where Atlanta really has made significant improvements, which could be a really huge deal for them. And we've seen, I think, Tevin Coleman be pretty effective so far for the team. So their offense,
although obviously
could be good.
he's got some ribs, the broken ribs, so he'll be out for a couple of weeks. But yeah, he's looked good.
So yeah, I agree. It's interesting. It's interesting to see a team that is so defense dominated and then a team that's so offense dominated. Kind of that clash of styles. So I'll be fascinated to watch them play each other.
Yeah, that will be good. I mean, I think sometimes you have to look at those teams a little bit with the sort of the Belichick philosophy of stop what they do best. The problem is when you play the Carolina offense, like, what's the thing you need to stop without Kelvin Benjamin around? I guess it's Greg Olsen, I suppose. Is it the running game? I mean, Stewart has less than 4 yards per carry so far. With Atlanta, you know what it is. It's Julio Jones.
Yeah, not that you can stop it, but yes. You probably shouldn't leave him in single coverage, though, in the fourth quarter. Just throw that out there.
I don't understand. Yeah. I mean, I don't understand the single coverage thing. I don't get that at all. But then I don't understand the flip, right? That they were doing the same thing with Odell Beckham. And not even their best cornerback. They would, Dan Quinn comes to the Seattle school to play your cornerback by sides. Mm-hmm. So they were leaving Trufant on the other side and letting Alford play on ODB the whole day and getting killed. So I don't quite understand the defensive strategy at the end of that game for either team. But I also don't know if Carolina can stop Julio. The cornerbacks there are good, but they're not great. Certainly Tillman's not great anymore. He's
big.
Older, slower. The strength of that team is the front seven.
For sure.
So I don't quite know how they stop Julio Jones other than just trying to get to Ryan.
Yeah, exactly. That's their only chance there. And I would say from the offensive perspective, the Panthers, really their only offensive strength is the fact that Newton can convert third downs by himself pretty easily with his legs. So I'm not sure if they have the linebacking speed to stop that, but I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, I have one of the questions I got on the Twitter is, can we just delete the entire NFC South, put them on a garbage barge, and let them go?
Oh, that hurts my feelings. Come on.
Football Outsiders has historically low following in NFC South cities compared to other divisions. But there is a lot of interesting stuff going on in that division. Atlanta and Carolina are interesting teams. Tampa, you have watching Jameis Winston is very interesting. New Orleans that's like a garbage barge fire at this point. So that's enjoyable just from the garbage barge fire standpoint and from the I can't believe the backup quarterback got an advertising deal perspective. Makes New Orleans kind of interesting, especially if that guy ends up having to play.
He may start this week, and then it'll be really fascinating. So, they locked him in at a cheap deal, and now he's going to be a star.
There's interesting stuff going on in the NFC South.
Yeah, you don't have to be a great team to be interesting. I think that's what I would tell everybody that's like, wow, let's not talk about the South too much anymore.
Right. I mean, the NFC South is certainly, I think, more interesting than the AFC South, although obviously, look, Mariota, that's interesting. What on earth is going on in Indianapolis is fascinating. But the NFC South, and I mean, get used to them, okay? because two of those teams are probably going to the playoffs. It's probably going to be Atlanta and Carolina. I think that despite Tampa Bay's win over New Orleans, there's a clear gap right now between those top two NFC South teams, which look mediocre with easy schedules, and the bottom two NFC South teams, which look terrible with easy schedules. But those top two teams are going to the playoffs. They are both going.
Well, I like your boldness. I am still a little bit worried about some of the more difficult teams the Panthers have to play, but we'll talk about that as those games approach in future weeks. So, Aaron, is there anything else that you wanted to cover on today's show?
Let me hit up one more Twitter question that we got here. This is from Tugboat31, and he asks, how do you think the AFC East will shake out now as opposed to before the season? I'll tell you what I think, which is that, golly, it looks like it's shaken out exactly as I expected before the season, which is the Patriots are dominant.
Yes.
The Jets' defense is much improved, and they're going to be a wild card team. And Buffalo and Miami are going to be good, but not good enough to make the playoffs. I mean, that's what I expected before the season, and that seems to be how it's shaken out so far.
Your preseason DVOA ratings seem very prescient so far. I've been surprised that the Dolphins haven't been able to generate more pass pressure with all of the guys like Sue that they've added to that front. But it just hasn't happened so far. I think they're really going to have to show improvements if they want to turn this thing around.
They're not even stopping the run that well.
No.
Right? So, I mean, the whole thing about Sue is not only Sue brings pass pressure, but you still mostly expect the pass pressure to be coming from Olivier Verdon and Cameron Wake.
Yeah.
Sue draws a double team, but the real strength for him with Detroit was because it's not just him, right? They also brought Mosley in from Detroit. Is what he did for the run last year. And yet Miami is allowing 4.1 yards per carry, which is not a lot, but it's not the kind of lockdown run defense that you would expect based on what you thought was going to happen with Sue. But the bigger question for me about Miami is the offense. Why won't they play Lamar Miller? Why won't they play Kenny Stills? I understand Rashard Matthews, after doing nothing for 3 years, looked really great in preseason. Okay, fine. Why is Stills not playing ahead of Greg Jennings? That doesn't make sense to me. Brandon Albert, the injury is awful for them.
Yeah.
Hamstring injuries tend to last. They trouble you for weeks. It's not just a 1 or 2 week thing. Cameron Wake has a hamstring injury now. Miami... It turns out that the numbers were more right, I think, about Miami than subjectively we thought. When the new projections came out, Miami did not come out very well. I said, I feel like we're missing something in these new projections, but it turns out we probably weren't missing anything. Miami may be the weakest of these four teams, even though it looks like it still looks like they have a better quarterback situation than either the Jets or Bills. The Jets and Bills are so much better on defense.
Sure. All right, Aaron. I look forward to seeing these next set of games. Things are starting to get really interesting, I think, so far in the season. Thanks so much for joining me on the show, and thanks to everyone that's made it this far. Please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes if you haven't already, and check out Football Outsiders, check out Fantasy Insiders, and check out some of the stuff that we'll be doing at Sports Info Solutions coming up.
Yeah, I definitely want to remind people, Fantasy Insiders is the sponsor for this show. It's great content for people who play daily fantasy games, including DraftKings and FanDuel and a lot of these other companies. There's a weekly article by Vincent Verhey breaking down Football Outsiders numbers for help with the best values in your FanDuel league. So people should definitely check out Fantasy Insiders. And yeah, it's difficult to get the charting thing organized early in the season, and there's not a lot of data after a couple of weeks. But I definitely feel like we're going to have some really great stuff later in the season once we've got it all organized and we've got a bigger sample size. And I really look forward to bringing it to people on the podcast. So people need to stay tuned.
Yeah, me too, Aaron. So thanks again, and I will talk to you and everyone else next week.